Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today is another Roundtable episode with Martha Tatarnic leading a conversation featuring me, Loren Richmond Jr., as well as Larry Lynn and Dennis Sanders. I trust you know who I am, so here's some information about Larry and Dennis. Larry Lynn was born and raised in San Jose, California, and has degrees from Cornell University and Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Larry's been a pastor for 10 years, and he currently serves as a pastor at Grace Life Church, a non-denominational church in the Baltimore area. Previously, Larry worked for a college ministry in the Washington, D.C. area, as well as for a nonprofit called the One America Movement, equipping faith leaders with resources on toxic polarization. Larry enjoys writing about church and politics, doing deep dives on Wikipedia, and making music. Larry lives with his wife and 2 children in the Mount Washington neighborhood of Baltimore. Dennis Sanders is a Michigan native, a lover of the Detroit Lions and Michigan State Spartans, and an ordained minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Dennis has degrees from Michigan State University and Luther Seminary. Dennis is currently the pastor at First Christian Church in St. Paul, Minnesota, and the host of the Church in Maine podcast, which I recommend. Dennis lives in Minneapolis with his husband, Daniel. Please take a moment to rate and review this episode on whatever podcast platform you're listening on, and if you find it helpful, please share it with a ministry friend. Our mission is to help you and your church walk boldly into the future.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. I am your co-host, Martha Tatarnic, and today I am facilitating a panel discussion about a topic that has sparked a lot of questions for me, and I imagine for a lot of others as well, which is the relationship between American politics and the church. Now, before giving our guests a chance to introduce themselves, I should just remind our listeners of a little bit about where I come from in moderating this conversation. I'm Canadian, and I am an Anglican priest, so very much part of the mainline church, serving a congregation in Niagara, which isn't too far away from the border with our American neighbors. Our political and religious landscape, though, in Canada, even if we are near the border, is quite different from our neighbors to the south, and it can sometimes be quite baffling to many of us in the north, and particularly with the election this month. A lot of us have had a lot of questions. So that's a little bit about me, but what you're really going to want to know about today is about who our guests are. So I'm going to ask each of you to give a little introduction of what sort of religious and political space you live and serve in. And maybe, Dennis, I can get you to go first.
All right. Hello, my name is Dennis Sanders. I am the pastor of First Christian Church in St. Paul, Minnesota, and that is from the mainline Protestant denomination. And I've been pastor here for about 11 years. Kind of the context that I serve in is being that it is the Twin Cities. It's pretty much I would say a Democratic, or to use the colors, blue stronghold, and so is my congregation. Just for listeners who may not be in the United States, being also in Minnesota, our governor, Tim Walz, was the running mate for Kamala Harris on the Democratic ticket. So that's kind of been my context and where I'm from.
Thanks, Dennis. And Larry, can you just share with our listeners your context?
Hi, my name is Larry. It's a great pleasure for me to be here and be part of this podcast. I grew up in a non-denominational church. It was a Chinese immigrant church in California, and now I pastor at Grace Life Church, which is non-denominational. But I did spend most of my life, as well as my ministry career, in conservative spaces, theologically and politically. And it was only more recently when I would say now I'm more of in a moderate context. However, I've only ever lived in blue states, and so that frames my theology as well and my politics. And I've been living for the past 11 years now in Baltimore, which is a very blue city, majority black city. And that's where I am.
Thanks, Larry. And one of the reasons why I am facilitating the panel today, not just because I was the one with a lot of questions, but it gives Loren, your regular host, a chance to be on the panel and to weigh in a little bit too. So Loren, do you want to just fill in a bit about your context politically?
Yeah, so I live in Denver metro of Colorado, and one of the interesting things in the last 12, 15 years is Colorado has become a red state to a swing state to a really solidly blue state. Interestingly enough, Colorado tends to have a high number of independent voters who are non-affiliated. So I'm technically a non-affiliated voter myself. But interestingly enough, I live in a part of the metro area that has our congressional district has a swath of kind of rural-ish, another section of state that's more conservative. So really, we just had our district just went red. So it's interesting. Colorado, broadly speaking, kind of, the whole country, broadly speaking, shifted right, and Colorado, broadly speaking, didn't quite follow those shifts. So it's really interesting, the trends in Colorado versus the national trends.
Okay. So with American friends that I've been talking to, American podcasters that I listen to, emotions have been running pretty high since the beginning of November and the re-election of Donald Trump. How are things in your spaces? What emotions and tensions are you living with in the communities where you live and serve? Dennis, why don't you lead off again?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I try to stress, we did a service that was we call it an election eve service that was based on something called Election Day Communion, which was actually started at the 2012 election. And one of the things that I try to do is to really focus on what was the most important thing here. And we follow the Revised Common Lectionary. That the gospel for that day was from Mark, and it was talking about what was the greatest commandment, and it was basically to love God and to love others, and to have people really focus on that and on the communion table, and especially from my tradition in the Disciples of Christ. That is something that's central to us. We have communion every Sunday, and that no matter what happens, whether the person that you want would win or lose, that this is what is most important. And so that was kind of the thing that I centered on. And then following the election, the following Sunday, we didn't focus as much on the election, but we did want to offer prayers. And I was very specific that we would want to offer prayers for the president-elect. And I know that a lot of people in the congregation were pretty not Trump supporters. But I think that was something that's important. That was important to pray for our leaders, and just to have that sense that this is, while our politics matters and is important, it's also our faith, that is more important, and that we try to be centered in that we love God and love each other, no matter what, and no matter what the situation was. And so that's kind of where we were at and have been at, in the weeks following the election.
Okay. How about you, Larry? Like, how have you spoken into the political situation? Do you sort of disclose where you sit on the questions? Do you speak from the pulpit about this stuff?
Yeah, so I think about my political conversations in terms of 3 dimensions. Okay, so the first dimension is what I speak to people privately, just with friends, trusted individuals. And in those contexts, I share the most about my personal political opinions. And then there is what I might share in a public platform, in a podcast like this or on social media. And then there's what I would share less. I would still share, but I'll share less. And then there's what I would share when I'm preaching a sermon, or when I am in a specific position, when I'm representing the church or the views of the church, like from a pulpit. Then I share even less about my political views. And so I think it's helpful to have a little bit of a framework like that, where you are you're intentional about what content you're sharing and in what platform. Right. And so I do share, so I grew up in a very apolitical church. It was culturally conservative, but we never commented on politics. And it was only in adulthood, moving to Baltimore, I started to meet pastors who were more outspoken politically. And also that's when I just started to read more broadly, about church history, and, just learn about the influence the church has had, when it came to the abolition movement in the British Empire, or with civil rights here in the U.S. I would just read about pastors. They would talk about political issues from the pulpit, and just reading the Bible even, and just seeing how often, prophets in the Bible would condemn secular governments, or John the Baptist would call out Herod, for taking his brother's wife. And so I would see examples like that, and I became more convicted of like, even though I'm a pastor, even though I believe technically in the separation of church and state, I do think there's a place to speak up. And so it was maybe starting from about 5-6 years ago when I started to be a little bit more vocal. But I never endorsed candidates, and I never endorsed parties. I stopped short of that. But I do speak up when I feel like the gospel pertains to the current issues at hand,
Yeah, that makes sense. So, like, how have you been speaking up in this context?
Oh, yeah. So we did a sermon series in the spring leading up to this, and it was about 6-7 weeks long, called the Way of Jesus in Civic Engagement. And we just talked about, what it means to have our primary allegiance be Jesus, as opposed to He's our Lord, as opposed to, any political leader. We talked about loving our enemies. We talked about submitting to governing authorities, but we also talked about when is there a scenario when you should speak up and not submit to governing authorities, because we also see examples of that in the Bible as well. And so, yeah, we just talked about a lot of these nuanced issues. And so, and I feel like a lot of, maybe thinking about it this way, a lot of times when events happen, it's the time to speak up has already passed, and I think you should still speak up, but it's almost too late to speak up, because the people respond to current events because they are formed in a certain way. And unless you have a culture of theologically, spiritually forming your church, so that they would be people of peace, so that they would be people free from anxiety, so that they would be people who would put Jesus first. Unless you do that from the get-go, then when current events happen, I mean, they are going to be angry, and they are going to, hate people, and they are going to maybe think about violence and think about canceling people out. And so when the current events happen, emotions are so hot, a lot of people, they're not ready to hear things, so I think a lot of the work happens before, in the years before any given event, so that they have the spiritual disciplines in place, the practices in place to actually be people of peace rather than act out in some dangerous way,
Yeah, so a lot of forethought went into that series earlier in the year. That makes sense.
Yeah. And it wasn't just that, we had a panel discussion where we talked about politics, at another event. We had a prayer event in regards to Israel and Gaza. And so, we try to, this is something, it's a regular diet. You can sort of think of it that way. We regularly take these vitamins, these spiritual vitamins on these different topics, so that when events happen, we're ready,
Yeah, I like that. Spiritual vitamins. Loren, where are you experiencing people's emotions at right now in the spaces that you're moving in? I think sometimes people's emotions come out in strange ways when they're running high, different things get projected and so on. What are you seeing?
I mean, I think it's interesting because I'm in my primary context working with people who are most likely to be negatively affected by the incoming administration, working in affordable housing, low-income housing with seniors. I mean, it's interesting. I'm curious really to how folks' work has been really busy of late because of broader context, broader things. And I really haven't had a chance to really engage with folks as much as I would like, especially some of the folks who, I'm thinking about, because I think in my building there are folks who I'm not sure if they are citizens or if the whole family is citizen. And I know there's been threats about removing folks from affordable housing, government-funded affordable housing, if any member of the family is not a citizen. And I'm also reminded that there's people in the affordable housing complex who I know are Trump supporters. And I've had to really, the day after the election, really had to smile and focus my kindness despite what I felt about the outcomes.
Right. As I have said right from the outset here, I had a lot of questions about how American politics and the church get intertwined. It is vastly different from the expectations in Canada, where, speaking out about your religious views or affiliation can be damaging to political campaigns rather than advantageous. So I've really tried to listen carefully to what the rationale is between supporting Donald Trump and being a Christian, because there is a very strong connection between those two in American politics. And what I keep hearing is that, from kind of Christian influencers, I guess, especially in the more evangelical tradition, is that they're not claiming that he's a good person, but that he stands for policies that they stand for as Christians. Now, I feel like that doesn't necessarily clarify anything for me, because I don't really understand how deporting millions of people and abusing women and expressing admiration for Nazism, how those could be things that Christians support, or that they think somebody could support, and represent them. But Larry, I want to start with you. I am getting to a question here, as I kind of talk through some of my bafflement about all of this that's been going on. You have done work in training Christians to be peacemakers. So, how do you manage that line between loving and listening to our neighbors, especially those we disagree with, but also needing to be an outspoken voice against policies that really harm people?
Yeah. And so, just to give you a little bit of background. So during the pandemic, I stepped down from being a pastor for a little bit. Part of it was I was in a state of theological transition, and I was exploring where I stood on some things. But also, I just needed a break from ministry. So I worked for this organization. They're called the One America Movement, and they're nonpartisan. They're a nonprofit, and they train clergy on how to be peacemakers. And so I just did that for about 2 years. But it was really valuable experience, and I learned a lot. A lot of what we did was we tried to integrate social psychology research, things like why does misinformation happen, and why do echo chambers happen, and things like that with, biblical principles. So the organization as a whole, they work with people from different religious backgrounds, but I specifically work with evangelicals because that was my background. And I think there's a lot of different things we can talk about. One thing that's sort of fascinating is I don't think the average church talks about politics, and so I think sometimes on the news when we hear about the link between the Republican Party and the Republican Party and the church, or the evangelical church, it seems we might get the impression as an outsider that every single evangelical church is supporting Trump, but that's absolutely not the case.
Okay.
In my work, I often encountered a lot of pastors who, some of them weren't Trump supporters at all. They didn't like Trump, but even those who did vote for Trump, most of them I found were, I would consider, reluctant Trump supporters, and most of these people, they didn't talk about it from the pulpit, and a lot of times these folks, they would come to our events. And they would say, I'm bewildered why so many people in my church are voting for Trump and are in love with Trump, because I'm certainly not like that. And so the message we got, it's not that you had a few charismatic leaders who were Trump supporters firing up the masses to vote for Trump. It seemed like a lot of the people we were working with, they were concerned that their masses were almost worshiping Trump, and they didn't know what to do about that. So that's one dynamic to be aware of. Another thing I think that's important to point out is the term evangelical has changed a lot over the years, and there's a very interesting study put together by Ligonier Ministries. That was R.C. Sproul's ministry. They did a survey a few years back where they basically polled self-identified evangelicals on different beliefs, and they found that a significant number of people who are self-identified evangelicals, they don't even believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And, they're like, there are some basic core Christian tenets they don't believe, but they would have believed that homosexuality is sin and abortion is wrong and things like that. And so I think the term evangelical has shifted such that a lot of folks, they would identify as evangelical, even though, in my book, I wouldn't even consider them Christians.
Right. Okay. That's really interesting.
But it's become a political label. So I think that's a
political label. Yeah, that is really insightful. And frankly, kind of anecdotally, that tracks with people that I've interviewed for this podcast who identify as evangelical leaders who have pretty explicitly said that they don't support Trump, either on the podcast or in conversation behind the scenes. So I think it is really helpful just to name that evangelical Christian right that does get, for pun intended, trumped up in in the media
Yeah.
as like this cohesive block is actually a lot more mixed. I think that's super important.
I mean, it is true. There are very many prominent evangelical leaders who are Trump supporters, but you're just to your point, it's not a cohesive block. I think there is a pretty big divide, for example, between urban evangelicals and non-urban evangelicals. I think there's also a pretty big divide between, white evangelicals and non-white evangelicals. And so I think there's a lot of, and also I would say Southern evangelicals and non-Southern evangelicals. And so there's none of these are hard and fast lines, but I've also been bewildered just because I'm in a space where I interact with a lot of evangelicals, and I'm personally on the fence about whether to identify as an evangelical, but a lot of my circles, they identify as evangelicals. And most people I know here in Baltimore, they're not Trump supporters, or I know a handful of reluctant Trump supporters. But I'm only, I'm not representative of all evangelicals too. My experiences are limited and biased as well.
Right. Yeah. Dennis, how about you? I mean, you referred initially to that call to prayer and to pray for the newly elected president. Are there other strategies that you would weigh in with here about how we navigate difficult conversations in our congregations, how we love and listen to people that we disagree with?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I have been thinking about a lot, and I thought about a lot actually since the first Trump administration, really is the role of class in American society, in that we don't really talk about it as much. And that's even very true within the church. My context for people is that I grew up in my hometown is Flint, Michigan, which is, for people who don't know, it was the birthplace of General Motors. It was very much a auto town. Both of my parents worked in the plants. So I kind of come from that working class background and always think a lot about places like Flint or Youngstown or other places that have, because of changes in the economy, been left behind. And those are some of the places actually where Trump's message actually has been picked up. And if we look at the results from the election, it's interesting that a lot of the working class states, especially the so-called blue wall states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, which have a lot of working class or blue collar people, all shifted red towards Trump. And so one of the things that I want to talk about, and it's not that I don't think that some of the issues like with evangelical influencers or misinformation aren't issues, but I think one of the reasons that Trump is such a kind of dominant force in American society is because of I think because of some issues involving class and involving the working class. And so my question always has been, where is the church in all of this? And in my church, primarily, it's mostly people who are professionals and doing okay. And that's not a knock against them or anything. That's the context that I'm preaching in and that a lot of my colleagues are in. But a lot of the people who I think voted for Trump, who may come from backgrounds where there isn't a strong religious background, and how does the church reach out to that? How does the church really include and I think listen to folk who are in the working class and are dealing with things that, kind of the uncertainty of employment and things to that extent. And I think that that's one of the things that I think is a strategy that the church needs to do in this time. And there are times to speak up. And I also need to kind of state I've never been a Trump supporter, but I've also wanted to listen to why people voted the way they did. And so I think that's actually one of the skills that we need to do, is to listen, is to find ways, and maybe to find ways of listening to people who might have voted that way, and why, that they did, and to have that sense of curiosity, and to try to figure that out, and then to find ways of supporting them. Because I think when you end up with things like populism, it's usually because something in society isn't working. People aren't feeling listened. Policies aren't really supporting them. So how do we listen to them and support them with policies that will help them? And so I think that's got to be one of the strategies for churches moving forward, is to actually listen, especially to people who voted for Trump. And listen to them, and really listen, not simply to provide an answer, not to just kind of, try to offer excuses, but to really listen to them, and then see where we can work together, and where God can lead us.
Yeah, I think that's really important, that listening rather than scapegoating or kind of making assumptions. Larry, you look like you wanted to jump.
Yeah, I just want to echo that. I think that was a great point, Dennis. I think a lot of folks in the political world and in the religious world were caught off guard by Trump, and I think it just goes to show how little they misunderstood society, and a lot of times when, just like Dennis was saying, when a charismatic leader comes around and has mass appeal, I think it's because people were craving something that they couldn't find in any of the other political candidates or any other thing else in society. And I think that speaks volumes about the state of our country and the state of the church. So, for example, so I think sometimes on the left, so I lean left, and so I hang out with left people a lot, and sometimes people just say like, "Oh, I'm so bummed. It was so shocking to discover that half of our country was racist, or half of our country was sexist, or something like that." And I think that's overly simplistic to say something like that. And I don't agree with that assessment. I think when you say that, you're just assuming, like, oh, these people voted against me because they're racist and sexist, and you're undermining some of the legitimate reasons they might have had to vote the way they did. For example, the economy. The economy is not when you're voting in the economy is your number one issue. That doesn't mean you're a racist or a sexist or something. It just means you were stuck in a financial rut, or you were struggling to get by, and no other candidate seemed to be giving you a narrative that made sense, but this candidate was. And so I think that's really what it comes down to, is Trump has been able to market himself as a way to, he gives narratives to people who are looking for a narrative. And maybe that narrative is like, oh, the immigrants are taking our lands, or maybe that the narrative is, men, can't do anything in society anymore. Whatever that narrative is, he's selling them a narrative, and it's working. And, but I think I would want to say the church also has a narrative, which is the gospel. And so how can the gospel meet people where they're at, and what would be a vision of a gospel-centered, how can you be a gospel-centered man? What would manhood look like in light of the gospel? Or what would serving the poor look like in light of the gospel? And I think the church can also deliver, I would say, a more accurate narrative and compel people that way, so that people don't have to go around looking for, other narratives that can be dangerous.
Yeah. Loren, I'd love to hear from you as we're kind of talking through this polarization and perhaps the Christian call and response.
Yeah, I really appreciate what Larry and Dennis have both brought to the conversation. I'm reminded of my own work in church leadership, especially when I was leading a new church start. Something that I really tried to emphasize I don't think it really resonated with denominational leaders or other folks in similar contexts to me. Was my focus was really saying, like, to my prospects, so to speak, or to the folks who weren't really engaged, was to say, like, I hear you when you say you're struggling to pay your mortgage. I hear you when you're struggling with your kids. I hear you when work is tough. Like, I hear you. I want to hear you. Not to say that you shouldn't care about, immigration and the very real struggles people are facing to come here. Like, why would they risk their lives to come here? Like, not that we shouldn't care about those issues, but when people don't feel heard, when people don't feel like we're hearing them about their real struggles to pay their bills and to provide for their family and care for their children, like, when they don't feel heard, like, I'm just thinking, like, last night I went and bought eggs. And, eggs has been one of those social media things, like, oh, the cost of eggs, right, is so expensive. And, like, Colorado, I didn't even know this, and I just, like, heard this on the news and then saw it in the store. Colorado just passed a law, like, only allowing cage-free eggs. And I just thought, like, how preposterous is this? Like, we're in a context nationally where people are fretting about the costs, and I think rightfully so. Like, Colorado is an insanely expensive place to live. And here the blue leaders, the Democratic leaders, have said, like, hey, we need to make eggs even more expensive. And again, I don't want to dismiss whatever, like, there are some issues with factory farming, blah, 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 but not listening to people when they say, hey, like, the cost of eggs, the cost of food is a very real challenge. Like, I think that's that's a huge problem. I think folks just aren't listening. And again, we could broaden this conversation because I'm reminded of, like, the data from Ryan Burge, and just in my own church context, how, like, folks who tend to go to mainline churches tend to be, like, upper class and well educated, and they're just that. So I don't want to take over the conversation, but I would kind of echo what Larry and Dennis have said there.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in our Canadian context, like the political commentators that I listen to really stress that there is a big wake-up call for all of us who might lean liberal or kind of the more left end of the political spectrum, to take seriously what is being communicated here, which is that people feel left behind and that they feel left out. And I think what all of you are saying is that, like, the Christian gospel has always had a lot to say to those who feel like they live on the margins. And I like that being a really dominant response from us in terms of how we are called back to that need to speak to people's sense of alienation and struggle. I'm curious, like, I'm hearing all of you express just a ton of charity and Christian neighborliness towards those who disagree with you. Do you feel like targeted or not listened to by those who disagree with you? Like, do you feel like you're are there things that you wish people who disagree with you would understand about your position?
I mean, I'll start off. The one thing that we talked about when I was with the One America movement is the importance of the messenger in communicating things, because the reality is some people, they just won't listen to you, if you're the wrong messenger. And I like to think about it in, if you just imagine a spectrum from 0 to 10, and this can apply to any topic, but let's say someone who is a 0 is like a hardcore Kamala supporter, and someone who's a 10 is a hardcore Trump supporter, right? And like, it's very hard for someone who's at a 0 to talk to someone who's at a 10. There's very little common ground. But what someone who is a 0 can do, can talk to someone who's maybe a 3 or 4, and maybe that person, can talk to someone who's like a 6 or 7, and that person can talk to someone who's a 10. And so I think I think about that framework a lot, just understanding in my context, given my influences, given who I am, given the labels I wear or whatever, only certain people will listen to me. People who are exactly like me, and people to the left of me a little bit, people to the right of me a little bit. But like, if you go any more than that, I'm probably the wrong messenger, And so I'm just trying to make a difference among the people who are in my, concentric circle, if you will, my sphere of influence, and just like the global church take care of the rest. And I think that's something I think about is, there are some people who are hardcore. They're buying every conspiracy theory under the sun, and they're just hardcore right or far left or far right. And, they probably won't listen to me, but if I could, and that's why someone, that's why someone who I would, consider like a never Trumper Republican would probably do, would probably, be more listened to by a Republican than in like a never Trumper Democrat, So I think a lot of what I try to do is just communicate to the people I think would hear, and hopefully inspire some of them to communicate to the people who wouldn't who listen to me,
Yeah. Okay. Loren or Dennis, do you find that that things are as like, how broken is American conversation right now? Like, do you find that you're able to kind of make those connections and talk to people outside of your sphere, or like, are the divides as kind of painful and hard and fast as they seem in like social media spaces and to me as an outsider?
I think in social media spaces, yeah, pretty broken. People are pretty much set in how they believe and what they believe, regardless of where they stand. I don't know how many memes I've seen, where people are making fun of the other side, and I see this from pastors too. And so it's pretty broken. I think, though, in other parts of society, it may not be as broken. But I think the question is, do we have spaces and places where we can come together and maybe not be the focus, not be politics, but something else that brings us together. The problem is that I just don't see a huge amount of those spaces out there. And I think it is even hard, because I find myself in some spaces where it's hard to talk about something if you disagree on an issue, because we're so set in this is the way that things are. And, if you have a differing view, I, don't want to talk to you, or it's more, I just don't understand you. And so I think discussion is really hard, because in so many ways we've built up all of these defenses and have really become acclimated to the belief that the other side is not simply mistaken, but I think evil in some ways. And so, again, I don't know how many times I've even read things where people have said, you can break off relationships with people, who disagree with you, and that's not a problem. And I always kind of look at that and think, well, that's not very Christian. That's not very much like Jesus. I don't think that's the whole loving your enemy. But I think it comes to when we put politics above everything else, when it becomes an idol, instead of, seeing it and being that as Christians that we are called to love one another, and not just kind of make politics our number one thing.
Yeah. I mean, the church is one of those spaces, right? Like the church is one of those embodied spaces. There is a big difference, and this is being detailed time and time again, between saying something online and having to actually look somebody in the eye and say it to their face. And that embodied community and embodied conversation, I think, inherently makes a difference in how people speak to one another and how people navigate difference. And, so I appreciate, Dennis, you're talking about prayer and centering prayer through these like challenging times. And Larry, I appreciate like the forethought of grounding people in constructive conversations months in advance of a contentious election so that you have those vitamin stores to be able to have difficult conversations in productive ways. Loren, what are you seeing and hearing about brokenness and difficult conversations and where they're happening and how they're happening well? Or if they're
I don't know if they are happening. I don't know if they are happening. I think and I think that's unfortunate. I want to give a shout out to one of the leaders and podcasters and Methodist pastor Jack Shatama, who's been producing a lot of good content on this and the importance of, he comes from a family systems theory framework to talk about how to have conversations, especially with contentious conversations that may come up, again, as we're recording this in America around the Thanksgiving dinner table. So I think I don't think there are happening, which I think is unfortunate, because I think kind of what we talked about, it's important that they do happen for change to take place. And I think there's kind of two dynamics, and it may be way off base here, but I think there's kind of like these two dynamics in America where it's like we assume social media is representative of how everyone feels about politics. Like everyone feels like super, and I was trying to do this as we were talking. I can't find the exact voter totals from 2020 versus 2024, but there is a decline in voter turnout from the presidential election. So I think that is interesting that, for several million people, and I don't know what the exact numbers are, but there's, again, millions of people, for whatever it's worth, made the choice not to vote. So I think that's a message in itself. And for whatever reason, they decided like it's not worth being a part of the conversation. So, which again, I think is data in its own right.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, I have two more questions as we kind of wrap up here. And I guess I feel like the two are related to one another, but the first question is like, where and when would it be necessary to offer resistance or civil disobedience to an incoming president when you see that people are being harmed as a Christian? So that's kind of my first question. Like, where's that line? And I think that's a different thing than not loving our neighbors or not listening to what people who voted differently from us have to say and what's really going on. Like, I think that there is still a question for us as Christians when people are being harmed by a political leader. Like, where is the place of resistance?
Yeah. I think this might sound like a cop-out answer, but I think that answer depends on the individual. I believe that there are different types of Christian leaders. And so some Christian leaders are more like, they're more peacemaker kind of Christian leaders. Some Christian leaders are more, you would say, prophetic, like taking a stand kind of Christian leaders. And, and I just think I think everybody has their own calling. And, I think there's probably a time, Nazi Germany is like the stereotypical example. When we look back now, when we see that the majority of the German church, was quietly, subtly, not getting in the way of Hitler, then we look back now and we say, oh, that was wrong. Like that was not good. The church was on the wrong side of history, the majority of the church. So I think there is a time and place where even the peacemaking, bridge building leaders, they need to get on board with taking a stand. But I think there's a gray space where it's not Nazi Germany, but it's also, but there's still some issues where I think during that space, I think it's okay for some leaders who feel called by God to take a stand. I think sometimes there's, in the news, for example, there are sanctuary churches, right? Where churches, they say, like, even though, for example, people they don't have homes, right? And they're not allowed to sleep on the streets, we're going to house them in our church. Or undocumented immigrants, they're going to be deported, we're going to keep them in our churches. So there's churches like that who take a stand and to prevent things from happening. And in some ways, it's not too different from what Rahab did, when her king of Jericho told her to take the spies and she hid the spies, So I think there is a biblical precedent for doing that if you want to take a stand, but I think it's issue to issue, and it's, I think I think God lays on our hearts different political issues to that we care about. And so I would never prescribe to like all Christian leaders, you got to do this,
Okay. I'm interested in, Loren and Dennis, whether either of you feel differently. Like, is there a line where it becomes a mandate? Like the Nazi Germany, that's always, I think, the example that we do turn to as a historical precedent. I would wonder whether, like, when we're talking about millions of people being deported and losing their homes and being separated from their families, like, is that a line that becomes a mandate where, like, millions of people are being harmed and Christians do have to speak up? Like, what do others think?
I think about about our current moment and some of the issues that we're facing is that I think on its extreme, it's very clear, but in its day to day, it's also very nuanced. And one of the issues, like immigration, I think there is a lot can make sense that our current immigration policy here in the United States has been in some ways out of control. We've not been good at policing our borders. And so that, I think, is a legitimate issue to talk about and to discuss. The question then comes, what do we do about it? And I'm not as personally opposed to that there are some cases where deportation makes sense. Does mass deportation make sense? Maybe not. And what if it means deporting, whole families, or if it means people who get caught up in the deportation who probably shouldn't have been deported, then I think those are times when the church does need to speak up and does need to say something, because it goes from, I think, simply trying to deal with an issue or the law to, I think, becoming abusive and becoming, harming others. And so I think that those are things that then where the church does need to speak up. Another issue that I think is similar to that is both nuanced, but also a time to speak up, could be issues dealing on, transgender issues. There are a lot of, I think, honest questions on the role of trans women in sports and all of that stuff that I think we do need to talk about. But we also don't want to go to the place where the state is, determining when you could, if you want to have any type of surgery. Even if I may think it might not be the best idea. I don't know if I want the state to do that or even just, basic rights. And so those are cases where I think the church should speak up, should say something. But it's kind of knowing the difference between those two, but understanding where the nuance is, but also where it crosses the line, and then where you have to say this is wrong and it's not acceptable.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I'm hearing from both of you that I appreciate so much is that prayerful discernment has to be part of how we navigate our way forward as Christians, like bottom line. And whether we're talking about this incoming administration or any other administration for that matter, like there is that constant call to be in conversation with the needs of our neighbors and the world around us, and where the gospel calls us to speak and act. Loren, do you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about a previous guest. Hopefully I can get her name right. Dorcas Cheng Tozen, I think, who wrote a book on social justice for the sensitive soul. Reminds me of what Larry was saying. She made the point that activism can be pigeonholed to this kind of fiery, really responsive act. And she made the point that activism can really be, needs to be more broadly thought of and for different kind of people who behave in different ways and think differently. So I think that comes to mind with what Larry said. And then two, I'm often reminded, like, because I've thought about this, like I work in Aurora, Colorado, where Trump has promised to start day one with actions. And I've thought, like, what is going to be my response as someone who works in federal affordable housing if I see, the National Guard marching down the street, if federal agents are coming to get someone out of the building? I've thought, like, what is appropriate? I don't know. I'm still wrestling with this. Like, when I think about for my family, like, what risks is responsible for me to take for my family, for myself? What's the right thing to do? I think it's really hard. It's hard for me, at least. I think it's easy it feels like on a philosophical level to say, like, we always got to stand up for, these things. Like, I think a lot of the ideas being bandied about are very inhumane, but I'm also wondering, like, what does it look like on a real practical level? And then I think on a more positive, like, what are things that I can control? What can I control, and how can I make a difference in my sphere?
Yeah. I think I'm quite taken with what you're describing, Lauren, that possibility of, like, the National Guard walking down the street to get people that, like, and have worked with, and what do you do? Like, these are moments, I think, where the rubber hits the road for us as discerning, prayerful Christians.
Yeah, it's like, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's like, I've literally thought about this. Like, do I stand in the doorway? Like, is it worth getting me arrested? Like, if there's, 10 agents, like, what is me going to get arrested, going to stop the situation? And, this is where I really wrestle with, like, is me, like, potentially losing my job, getting it, arrested? Like, what are the effects? I don't know. It's really hard, I think. And maybe, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's not just an interesting philosophical conundrum, is it?
Right.
Yeah. This is about like life and livelihood and family and justice and like the core of our Christian calling. Recognizing that we're kind of not going to be able to solve those biggest conundrums right here in this podcast space, and taking seriously what you have all said about discernment and prayer being integral to a way forward. I'd just like to offer you each kind of final thoughts on what you hope for Christian conversation and what you hope for Christian witness in the coming 4 years. Yeah, who would like to go first? Dennis, you looked like you were going to jump in.
I guess what I hope for is, again, ears to listen to what people have to say. And then I think discernment, to discern the times, discern the actions. And I think finally, and this is something I've been trying to do more, and actually I've kind of picked this up, Martha, from the Anglican tradition of praying for our leaders, and have learned to do that by name. And that's not always easy, but I think it is important. And I think that our leaders, especially our president-elect, needs the prayers. And so that we will continue to just kind of pray that they can govern justly. And that's kind of where I'm at right now for the next few years.
Yeah, I think my word would just be, don't be disengaged. I think there can be a temptation for Christians who are frustrated with the political system, or they just feel like, they're independent. For example, there's like Loren said earlier, there's a rising number of independents in our country, and they feel like, neither party speaks for me, or they don't want to get into conflict with people, so they just don't want to talk about politics. They don't want to rub people's feelings the wrong way, and so they disengage, And I remember I listened to a David French talk one time. He's a New York Times columnist. He's like a never Trumper conservative. And he was talking about the meme, maybe you've seen it, of Homer Simpson, and Homer Simpson comes out of the bush and then he just quietly goes back into the bush. And because, he's like, this is a crazy scene. Let me just go back to this bush where it's safe and I don't have to worry about what's going on. And he was just making the case, like, a lot of Christians behave that way when it comes to politics. They poke out, every now and then of the little hole, and they look around, they go, words are nasty and people are angry, so let me just go back to my little hole. And I just don't think that's how Christians ought to live. We are to be set apart from the world, but we're not supposed to be cut off from the world. And I do believe in that we are supposed to be like Jesus, and and how he became flesh and dwelt among us. I feel like we need to spend time with people around us. I think especially that we are, in the U.S. at least, we are in a democratic society. I think it's different, if in the Roman Empire, submitting to authorities, obviously we got to do that, but there were no elected leaders. But if we are in a democratic society, and what that means functionally is that every single citizen has political power. I think also the issue of, like, are we being good stewards of that political power? If we have the power to influence the politics of our country such that our neighbors are impacted, like, are we being good stewards of that power? And so I don't think this is a responsibility that we can just, turn over to the non-Christians. I think this is a responsibility that we need to engage in. And so, How people engage looks different. It could be social media. It could be, writing letters to your representatives. It could be going to political events, and, it could be donating to certain candidates. I mean, there's all sorts of things you can do, but, but I don't think we should sit out just because, things don't line up with us, or we don't like certain candidates or whatever. I think all the more we need to be engaged.
Yeah, I really appreciate that call not to disengage, because I see it very much in the mainline context in Canada, is that sometimes there is a tendency to equate like that call to be peacemakers with essentially just an opting out of difficult conversations altogether, and kind of choosing a surface politeness and niceness that is really just about not wanting to ruffle anybody's feathers or create any ripples in the water. So yeah, being willing to engage, and like you say, in a whole variety of ways, is extremely important. Loren, do you want to offer some final words as we wrap up this conversation?
Yeah, I think what I've been thinking about a lot, and again, this is to borrow from Jack Chitama, who has talked a lot about offering or at least as I spin it, offering a compelling vision, offering a compelling narrative. I think there's not been enough from the Democrats, from, I think, mainline, from my context in general, enough too I think people can, there's so much of folks saying what they're against, what they disagree with. Offer me a compelling vision about why your vision of America, vision of the church, vision of whatever is a better way of living. And I think that really will draw people when we, even if we talk about something like immigration, offer a more compelling vision of why, welcoming neighbors is good for everyone, and how it leads to a better future for our society, for our country, for ourselves, for so many things. I think offering a more compelling vision really has a way of, it is compelling. And I think whether it's political parties, whether it's the church at large, I think would do well to speak not as my way or the highway type approach, but say, hey, I have and to speak on, Larry made this point too. Like, I believe the gospel is a compelling vision. So let's talk about, here's a way of living. Here's a way of being in the world. Here's a way of following Jesus that offers a better way of life for ourselves, for our neighbors, for our country. So I'd love to see, again, specifically for the church, leaning into that alternative, compelling vision.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I want to say thank you to all three of you, Loren, for organizing this panel and being part of the insights offered here, Larry and Dennis, for making the time today. I feel like there are a number of things that you've said and shared that help me for sure as a Canadian and an outsider, get beyond the headlines and get beyond the social media sphere and be able to hear more about what's actually going on the ground, and what you're sort of thinking about and preparing for going forward in the political sphere, as well as how you're navigating them right now. So thank you to all three of you. We always end with a word of peace, and that seems particularly apropos to today's conversation and the hope that has ultimately been lifted up here. So may God's peace be with each one of you, Loren, Larry, and Dennis.
And also with you.
Thank you very much.
With you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Loren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.